think there's another point here that needs to be emphasized on the basic distinction between dualism in terms of true and false and dichotomies, which allow for differentiation into separate forms. And certainly social theory can be, does not have to be dualistic, it can simply be dichotomistic.
To probably annoy people who don't like stories, but I'm listening to you and I'm imagining, I spent a lot of time on the ocean, and there are fish and there are flying fish and there are diving ducks. And so, you know, you can be completely unaware of your social system, as a fish is, if you take water as a social system. You can occasionally get above it, like flying fish do, actually sometimes for like 100 yards, or you can be a diving duck that can experience air and the ocean or the social system. So I'm pretty sure that biological beings who are also social, sometimes can get a perspective that is not completely and utterly blinded by the social system or water they're in.
So the answer to that one, or the question I would put for that one, Mark, is you're Freddy the fish and you live in the middle of the ocean and you never see anything but water. And then one day a ship goes over the top of you and someone throws a bicycle off it and it comes past you. Can you work out what it is?
No, I'm not saying that you can do everything there. I'm just hinting that maybe lumen is an overstatement, because I think almost all statements are overstatement or they're useless, they're tautologies. So I actually think that people can, some people when they're very young, other people older, they can actually, for moments at least, get outside or get some perspective on the social system. They're not like fish who never can see above the water.
And it's that process that's really important, because Luhrmann calls that a re-entry into the system, which comes from Spencer Brown. So you have to take a model or an understanding of the system as you go back into it. And you keep repeating that in various ways. And it's important to understand what you're doing. And I think that's a thing that Klaus is actually saying, unless I've misunderstood him, is that if you, that abstraction you're taking into the model is very dangerous.
The only slight difference is the model is again an abstraction. And I don't think we need a model that is outside the system. We need a model on our participation in the system. That means we have to respect other people having their own models that live in the social system. And there has to be interaction between them and us. And when I say them and us, as if we are, a solid group. The point is that, to me.
So my argument was we can never construct a model. All we can do is find our way around our own cognitive space. And I think an activism has got the answer to that, where they show that basically going back to Piaget, where we are assimilating and accommodating ideas and equilibrating ideas. And we must understand that process is not perfect. So it's the I go back to what I'm saying, it's the adaptation, our ability to accommodate and assimilate ideas and move forward that's important, not the construction of models. So almost...
Can I maybe then interrupt? What is happening here, Jonathan, what I think you're saying is we're constructing and comparing models. So the progress is in the comparisons. Continuously, there is something and we compare, and now we creatively come up with something else and we compare. And so is the way the progress is being made. And also I hear you say exactly what Klaus is saying, like you have your model, Klaus has his model, I have my model, and we here try to emulate a social system.
And the only way is to, so these forums are incredibly useful, but they don't achieve anything.
They do.
No, hold on. You have to, at some stage, enact with the world to bring everybody back to a sense of reality.
Sorry, everyone goes back to reality the moment Jason clicks the end button, and we all do things, and we haven't had a discussion about all the interesting things that have been done thanks to the conversations here. I think it might be amazing. I mean, especially a year from now when you see the consequences.
Well. So far, we have not heard from our other three discussants from our previous session, Bob, Stuart, and Lowell. And we need to hear from you feedback after you're hearing any new insight here.
I don't know anything until I run an experiment to embody the ideas and tease out the interactions, the language, the communication. So I want to talk to Mark. You're an emergency physician. I was one of the pioneers in telemedicine and worked with Camp Lejeune in the military and created one of the largest telemedicine systems. In creating an emergency telemedicine system, I had to sit for weeks in an emergency room for 24 hours at a time to see the gestation of disease and problems, to be able to map the communication and language that need to be replicated in the technology that facilitated that conversation. So as an example, we got a T1 line to Camp Lejeune. T1 is like a dial-up basically in those days. But we headed to East Carolina School of Medicine, really good emergency physicians. Literally 12 hours after we got the connection, 19-year-old Marine got run over by a tank tread on the head. Luckily it was mud, so it didn't totally squash it. And they're in the emergency room. And as you know, military physicians have basic training, maybe not sophisticated training. So they're dealing with the side of the head that's bleeding, and the remote physician, because we're able to just sit there and move cameras and interactions, was saying, I'm sorry, his other side of the body is paralyzed. That means a hematoma is growing in the area that is not, that looks bad. You need to do that. Well, they've never done it, but we're able to facilitate that communication. And so I just want to come up with the model that is missing here. And it comes from Melvin Conway, which says any organization that designs a system, broadly defined, whatever living system you want to say it is, will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure, is a copy of the communication structure. So we talk about language, but language is an interactive structuring of knowns, unknowns, probes, etc. So if we can get a meta level of the communication structure. So in your diagram about how business eclipses the citizen, there is one issue that the cybernetic world must deal with, which are complexes. We can talk about complexity all day. That's bullshit. It's the complexes of a military industrial, or in your case, a hospital industrial government complex that doesn't allow public health and the citizens. So West Virginia gets everything distributed, and California with these wonderful hospitals is not producing the jabs in the arms. So what do we mean about will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure? That provides three things. One, language is neither true nor false. We can't use a physics scientific true or false idea. It is a model, a structure, like Jonathan talks about, of reality. Number two, Robert Rosen says you can look at the structure around which a biological system structures itself. So you can, as Klaus says, get outside the system by a participant observer. I'm an anthropologist, so participant observer type aspects are very important. So, and number three, so we need to be getting the critical theory of cybernetics to deal with the impediments of government in communications. So in a business government structure of a complex, you can only do it by creating a new communication structure with citizens, a countervalence. If you look at the structure of the founders, they understood Conway's concepts explicitly in the design of a citizenship, of government, of business, etc. And the words of Jefferson that says, oh my God, if the business gets too big, it'll destroy our communication governance structure. So what's important here is, indeed, is a legitimate object of study, the context, because that's what I define cybernetics as, is the science of the organization of that context. Is it vicious? Is it virtuous? Does it allow an evolutionary pathway to increase complexity? Complexity is not our enemy. So that was my...
Lloyd?
Yeah, this was very nice, Lowell. I want to make the point that it is not individual models only. Of course, we have individual models. We have psychologists ourselves. But the interesting thing about society is that it is a system which also continuously shapes models. And these models, when they are shaped, they tend to take over. They tend to take over and to have a life of themselves. So one of the important things in cybernetics is that the construction is bottom up, but once the threshold is reached, it's like reaction diffusion dynamics. So for example, not everybody may be aware of that, but you get a saddle point, you get the possibility that a new development is starting. And this type of system, which by codification of the communication creates new worlds, new perspectives, and then these perspectives collide and also sometimes go down, I think that's what makes it very interesting. So the interesting thing is not only why we have, of course we have our own models, as biological systems, as Rosen says, develop their own models. The question is that there is a cultural reality out there which is in interaction with those modeling.
We need to move from the age of constructivism to the age of conversation, of interaction.
Of constructed.
Constructed conversations, let's say, yes.
What is constructed?
What I would say is there are a whole set of conversational structures that exist already, and that when I watch people trying to get along in the world, what they don't have, and what I'm quite interested in, Carrie Turner and I are going to try to create, is essentially a pattern language of conversational types, so that in different situations you at least have choices that you could put in front of you. And you watch skilled facilitators, that's what I see they do, because I always hire them. I never try to get in front of a group myself without somebody who knows how to do that. So you really, but I think we have to be much more explicit. What's been said by a lot of people in this group is how important language and conversation is. I couldn't agree more. I think the work that people like us could do, some of us could do, is say, okay, now how can we make that more clear and more usable by normal people?
So for example, I for a couple of years, I taught the introductory course for a mixed natural science and social science class. And I had a political scientist and economist as guests in a forum. And the one can excellently explain to the students why the other is completely bullshit. Because economists, with their Pareto optimum, etc., live in and think in a different world than a political scientist.
Stuart, your turn. You're muted.
Go to Bob Knisley.
Okay, Bob.
I guess several comments, not all of which will be perceived as relevant. One, at the meta level, I would agree with George that about the problem of not representing women and children. I think that the species made a mistake when we went away from having female gods like Ceres. And I think that the biggest mistake in the evolution of the species was having the male turn out to be larger and more aggressive than the female, which is not always the case across the living world. And that led us to hierarchy and conflict. And at that level, and at the historical level, I'm reminded, as I often am, that
Bob has a
man could get up in the morning, do his get on his horse, and can you hear me all right?
No.
What was your basic?
You have a weak connection.
Try it again.
I was the historical comment. It says it's unstable. My apologies. Counties were designed so that a person could come to the county and do his business and go home again the same day. And the world has changed since then. And so we now have opportunities for what could be termed conversations involving thousands of people, crowdsourcing. And I think that we're looking at a different world of governance in the future with the advantages and the disadvantages of the internet. And I am reminded as ever that there is, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And so my concerns are at the lowest level of practice of designing government. That's warming up for Stuart.
Could I just interject something that I didn't say in my talk, but it's written in there and I say it in the little recordings. And you just reminded me. And I think Elinor Ostrom's work and a lot of other people globally around polycentric governance is not a bad way to think about what you just said and what I'm trying to say. And that is, we need to figure out what coalitions of groups and people actually are best positioned to understand and solve a problem. And we shouldn't confine that in the structure of a government that was designed based on the rate at which you could communicate on horseback. So we do need to do that. And it doesn't need to be. The reason it's hierarchical, our government in the United States, is because of the mode of travel at the time. If they'd had the internet, they probably, being as smart as they were, they probably would have figured out a way to get the right input for the right problem. And somebody's keyboard needs to be muted. But that's what I think polycentricity offers us as a concept and as a design structure.
Well, Carrie Turner, have you noticed that this group is hopelessly male dominated? And so that's why whenever Jamie spoke, she got more time than everybody else. Now we see you here, we really need to hear from some fresh minds, like you are new here, so what do you think of our discussion?
Okay, well, I am new, and John Vodenick suggested that I might like to join this group. I've been to a couple of previous meetings and sat on the sidelines and observed. I like to observe a system before I actually get involved with it. Really interesting discussions today, and I'd like to build on what Bob said particularly. I share George's concern for the future of the world. The purpose of a system is what it does, and I don't like what this system is doing, is my first point. I don't hold out much hope for government in its present form. I worked for 20 years in consulting, both with big corporations, and also I've worked in virtually every UK government department, including every part of the Ministry of Defence, the legal side, the Ministry of Justice, Health, Education, every element. And based on that experience, if that's the sort of experience that is happening across the world, I don't hold out much hope there. In fact, I'd go further and say, I don't hold out much hope for adults. There's a law that I call Turner's Law, and it is that no adult will trash a system that they believe they depend on for a living. And we've got a lot of adults dependent on a lot of these systems that we currently have. I'm not even clear about the conversation earlier about women versus men. In my career, I've come across some horrendously power-crazed women, and I've come across some men that are really great to work with. So I wouldn't be that judgmental about men versus women. Personally, I am very directed to looking at what can I do personally to change something, rather than saying what should be changed outside of me. And the big thing that I came to as a result of all of the above points is that the hope for the future is with children. At the moment, I'm not sure that the education system is empowering them and giving them the right approaches and skills to be able to create the new systems that we need. And I say new systems that they want, that they will in fact create if we are able to give them what they need to be able to do that. So what I'm doing is about doing exactly that, trying to create a new education system to empower children to be able to create the new, more ethical organizations and businesses and governments that we'll need in future. That's me.
Thank you, thank you. Stuart, finally your turn.
Yes, okay, I think I'm finally ready now. Well, I liked George's starting off with a deep historical perspective and then focusing on communication technology and what was available and how it tended to result in hierarchies. Obviously, the situation is different now due to the internet and social media. And there seems to be a shifting from regulating social systems through governing through institutions, laws, and bureaucracy. Now we have more of an opportunity to focus on conversations, either personally or telephone or through Zoom or something else. And so I think there are great opportunities there, both for conversation theory and for learning how to use these new technologies. So I hope that we'll focus on that or try to understand that shift.
Bernard, Larry, Lucille, Eagle, Bill, we haven't heard from you guys yet.
Okay. Thank you. I'll say so. I've been trying to get in on the chat, but there's such a lot of nonsense going on there. I don't mean to be rude, but really there is. So I'm just going to post in the chat because I've been arguing for the importance of something which is not in language only, and at the same time saying that we don't know, language is not well defined. So I'll give you, and I've been arguing for the role of something non-verbal, non-linguistic that can point to. For example, if I'm speaking to a French person, I can once I've learned to say what is that, I don't know, I can't remember saying. I can hold a pen up to a French person and say, "Qu'est-ce que c'est?" That's it, and we begin to understand each other. So, but I'm just about to post a quotation from Charles Sanders Peirce, which I'm sure everyone ought to know. The whole function of thought is to produce habits of action. Quarrel with that if you like. What a thing means is simply what habits it involves. Thus, we come down to what is tangible and practical as the root of every real distinction of thought, no matter how subtle it may be, and there is no distinction of meaning so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference of practice. So we have to ground the talking somehow, somewhere. Otherwise, it's just words passing each other by. Mutually intelligible hermeneutics, if you like. Thank you.
Larry?
Yeah, hierarchy is much more embedded than simply something necessary for our transportation systems. I'm not a linguist or a historian of language, but this idea is so embedded in our language that it's hard to even imagine an alternative way of thinking about how to organize complex things. And yet that's what is needed, I think. And in particular, when you superimpose on the hierarchy a reward structure, you get reward-oriented hierarchy. You have the origins of virtually all of our formal social structures, including governance. And when you add that, two other, you call them models, but I call them ways of thinking. The means ends oriented approach to purpose and the eternal truth oriented belief. You take those three things and they form a formidable, almost impenetrable triplet that drives the ways that we think about governance, whether it's in a corporation or whether it's in the government of a society. And if changes will happen, it will happen in the language first. The language has to change, period. Thanks.
Phil?
Yeah, I would like to add something about hierarchy, which is actually a fundamental issue in the evolution of society and even in the question of its complexity. But actually, what I find in general in discussions like these, and even in organizational science or social science, is that it is not made a sharp distinction between what is, let's say, elective hierarchy, where people elect their boss, their delegates, their representatives, and what is imposed hierarchy, which is coming actually from the inequality of resources distribution, inequality in cognitive capacities, and other types of inequality. So what I found unsatisfied in the discussion we had so far, even in this meeting today, is that there was a complete overlooking of this aspect. We can build all the models that we want, of course, but let's suppose that I were presenting you a model of human or social development based on the assumption of immortality. Probably you would say, okay, maybe the model is very nice, is interesting or well done or not, but you are missing a very crucial point in society. That is, we are mortal. And in my view, the same occurs every time that we are speaking about society and the evolution of society, and when we miss the point of hierarchy. Because even in the presentation had today, the idea is that people elect their representatives, their governors, but this does not happen actually. For example, business organizations, firms, companies, there is no any kind of elective hierarchy. So workers are not electing their boss. So they have to obey to their boss. Based on what? Not on some kind of agreement or deal between them on what is appropriate to do or not, but based on the inequality in resources distributions and also inequality in resources, produced resources. For instance, also what say in his speech, George, about productivity. You cannot talk about productivity without talking about the distribution of income, because the same productivity could be much more than enough than what we need as a world in a different setting of income distribution. So that's my, let's say, frustration in, frankly, I mean, honestly, in witnessing this debate so far.
Igor, Beer, Hamish.
Hey.
Igor, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Now I would like to go back to modeling, to language, and to biological evolution. So, well, for me, modeling is something which I can use to communicate or discuss, get feedback on my perspective of certain things. And frankly, I'm teaching KPIs to the students of economics. And well, it's very hard, but I try to make them understand that KPIs are there not for them to watch, to admire, but to communicate upon them. So it's a means of communication, a means of producing discussion, a means to clarify things. Right? And there comes language, which pretty much does the same. So frankly, I find models, a kind of a language, a different one. And frankly, I don't take English as my primary language. This is my third language. So it's not English, it's something else. But we use that models, words, sentences, written, spoken, to communicate. And this, I find them very, very similar. So the next thing is the biological evolution. You know, when we speak about biological evolution, do we mean the model that biologists presented to us as being evolution? Because frankly, evolution is far more complex than the model we have been presented with. So the evolution as we know it is a model, a language. And yes, well, it does evolve. Well, the last point I would like to put there is our limited capacity. Frankly, the models, our language, even the evolution as we understand it, or may, you know, use some concepts of evolution and put it from the biological to the development of the language, is frankly limited by our capacity to create models, to understand models, to communicate those in a language we use. And yes, here we are. And hopefully, you know, can we go from point A where we are to point B where we would like to be? Yeah, well, we will need to expand our capacity somehow.
You? Hamish?
It's been extremely interesting to sit and listen. And I can only express opinions from what I would call street level. I'm not an academic or anything like an academic. I might have a little bit of real world experience. I have to agree with both George and Mark in different ways. One comment I would have is I think that from a layman's perspective, there seems to be, in my understanding, a mix-up between language and communication. You can have the greatest language skills in the world, but you can't communicate to anybody. And you can communicate and speak to somebody, but not understand. And I think there has been so much talked in these meetings that is way beyond my depths of understanding, but that is critically important to be able to be processed and presented. The second aspect that really worries me is I fear greatly for what's going to happen to our societies in the next 10, 15 years, 20 years. And we talk about governance. Well, who holds governance? What is governance? In a simplistic form, governance is a type of power. But who wields the power? Is the power there through money? Is it there through security? If we look at what's happening and we talk about the oligarchs and we talk about the Soviet or the Russians as it is today, and we talk about Trump and we talk about what happened in Brexit or in the European Union or in the UK, there are trends that are all similar. And if we look at what happened in certain elements of getting success, it was those who held power outside the governance that forced it. And most of it was done through their ability to communicate in one way or another, either with a big hammer or the threat of a big hammer, or with the prize of big money to support, or by the way of using different forms of media to get people to believe in things. And the sad thing appears to be that there is a lack of understanding across the board with those with genuine knowledge, genuine wish to make a difference, to be able to present the correct arguments in a format that is believed. And I think that comes back to this lack of ability to communicate in whichever form is necessary to get the message over. I've been told it's a dirty word to talk about the power makers of this world, the money makers of this world, how it's abused. Well, if we don't talk about it, and we don't realize how much influence they're having on our governance, how are we ever going to overcome it? How can it be that certain things are done by certain people in high power that if it was me, I'd be in jail for? But because of their position, not necessarily their position, but their power system, it's accepted, or it's not accepted, but it's not gone against. We look today that comments being made in the UAE. Now, was this woman abducted by parents or not? But how does a government respond to it? Well, the first thing the government does is, well, if we go against this man, how's it going to hurt us? We sell weapons to them. There are so many examples of this that are occurring from the very lowest level in a village in Africa or in the Middle East or wherever to the highest forms in government. And we have to be able to address all of it to make a difference. I certainly don't have the language or the understanding to do it. I'm sure within the confines of all the people on this screen, there must be a way that can have great influence. But the biggest thing is, how do we communicate that in such a way that you can address it with success to the top and to the bottom? Because only by getting progression through all of those tiers, in my opinion, will it work.
Yeah. Richard, you haven't spoken yet.
You really want me to say something, huh?
Why not? Why not? We need everybody to say something.
Well, I found it very interesting getting involved with this community again after about 40 years ago. I was very intensively involved, and then found other places that were more productive and more time, but also conflicted. Part of what I'm hearing is, again, different communities that speak and talk different languages and view things differently, and yet we're all talking systems, cybernetics in different ways. I'm particularly interested in how you use, or how I use, and how others can use cybernetics and system science and others to address some very fundamental practical questions. Most of my interest over the last 30 to 40 years has been on high performance strategy work, leadership, practical aspects of that. Most of it now is focusing on sort of the future of the humanity and the world. Some of the stuff that George talked about, some of the stuff that Lowell talked about a couple of weeks ago leading up to this. What Gregory Bateson talks about, sort of the relationship between a conscious purpose and the broader ecology, and which I had not been aware of as much until Klaus made a comment several weeks ago, and I followed up and he gave me some pointers, and I've done a bunch of reading to catch up. But a couple of observations. First of all, I think Bob Nicely raised some points early on about government and governance and how we can improve it. And Stuart made some really important points with respect to the role of the partisanship and people yelling past each other and different views, and what I would argue the sort of the relationship between belief and I used to call truth or science. I actually like Larry Richards' observation several weeks ago. I think he called it best available knowledge. I think there's a difference between having accurate information about what's going on and inaccurate information. People believe both of those, but one of those is driven by profoundly positive feedback loops that say, you know, keep believing what you're believing, doesn't matter what the data says. And others, in terms of best available knowledge, is continually being self-correcting in terms of accuracy. I think there's a lot of really important questions that could be addressed with respect to current governance issues in the United States and elsewhere that are really, really critical to not only what's going on right now in post-Trump era, but to the future ability of humanity to begin to work collectively on addressing some of the real dangerous existential threats that we've identified, both in terms of the planet and in terms of the people. And yet the conversation has gone off into broad general abstractions about the nature of government and everything, which I find really interesting if I was sitting in a pub and having a beer, but that's not my primary interest right now. So I would really like to have gotten into some practical discussions about, given what's happening right now in the United States and elsewhere in terms of the nature of governance, a little broader than what Bob was originally raising, but the role of government, how we can improve it, how you can address some of these broad societal issues that have a huge impact on the nature of government and vice versa, because there are real consequences to that. The second comment I would make, and this is all done in a spirit of conversation. This is not, I'm not trying to harangue anybody or, you know, harshly criticize places where I could have differences of opinion. But the second point, George made a comment earlier today with respect that why do we spend so much, that cybernetics is myopic, if I heard it correctly. And I actually think that reflects some of this difference that Mike Jackson made either last week or the week before, that it's, and at which I've used similar language. It's not just where things fit in terms of, you know, the kind of phenomena we're studying, but you have different communities, and they can be communities of, language, they can be communities of action, and they can be addressing the same kinds of concerns, but talking past each other all the time. So I happen to think that cybernetics is the most critical field with respect to dealing with these issues about the nature of humanity, especially about governance, especially how we're going to deal with the broad issues of the Anthropocene. But I think, system science, and I have my feet in both those communities probably equally. System science deals with everything in the universe, but the most important part of the universe are human beings. And it's not just because it's our group, it's because human cyberneticity, the ability to engage in effective action, is the most singularly profound emergent property in the known universe. Because we have the ability to transcend lots of physical and biological and technological and social constraints and limits. And we have the ability to shape not only ourselves being highly self-organizing, but we're also highly other organizing. So we organize other human beings, we organize aspects of this little spaceship Earth. And oh, by the way, we're now beginning to realize that there are counterproductive and counterintuitive results to conscious purpose, and in particular, conscious action. So I think cybernetics, both first order cybernetics and second order cybernetics, gets at the heart of everything we need to do. That doesn't mean a particular way of looking at something is the only way of addressing it. So I found it interesting. I mean, Stuart Umpleby had turned me back onto this, and I appreciate, Jason, you inviting me, and I found it very useful. One, to listen to the comments and the perspectives, because even if it's something that's not my particular priority, I find it interesting, whether it be issues of language or whether it be issues of cognition. But boy, I would love to get back to some of the points that were originally raised by Bob and Stuart and others have talked about with respect to the role of government, current politics, the ability of how we construct better societies that can address compelling people-centric issues as well as planet-centric issues. And in that context, most of my work right now, as Larry knows, because he and I have had some side conversations that have been very helpful, a lot of that is historical. It's not just theoretical and scientific. It's what has humanity actually done, especially over the last 500 years when we started creating the Anthropocene. And so, for example, I'd love to have some more discussion about some of the points that George raised today, but also that Lowell raised several weeks ago with respect to the historical background of how things unfolded. I mean, I was familiar with a lot of it, but he had some comments in there that I hadn't looked at from quite that same perspective. So to me, these conversations are important, but my plea in raising my hand would be, since you asked, Jason, is that I would love to get back to a little bit of some of the questions that Bob and Stuart had originally raised in a more explicit, less general way about the role of government. As an example, I don't think that's the only thing that these REMI conversations should be about.
Why don't you write it up as a title, abstract outline, and we will do a new session.
I'll consider doing that. I've got to be careful because I've got granddaughters in California. I'm in North Carolina right now. I've got granddaughters and daughter who are moving back to Australia in a month, and we have to see them before they go. And so we just got our shots and we're leaving for California. We're bi-coastal. I go back and forth between Silicon Valley and the beaches of North Carolina. So I would be happy to put something up and give a presentation. I do find these conversations valuable and some elements of it more valuable. And again, valuables matter for me, stretching it. But boy, it would be nice to be able to go back to some of the loops of stuff that we've covered in and that's what you were trying to do today, Jason. So I appreciate that. And I think
actually, have you noticed that each time or each session we are making a 2-hour movie together?
Yeah,
we do have some good stuff, and in the future, our students will refer back to these conversations again and again, I'm sure. So, and also there are good things in the chat box. If you forgot to save your version, it's always, we are all brilliant minds here. Who else not spoken yet today? Richard? Richard, you have not said anything today. You are muted.
Yes, I'd like to go back to Mark's opening presentation and the 2 questions that were raised. How can we make good decisions? And how can we design ethical behavior? Both of those things are quite possible to do with groups that I've worked with. And using this tool that is in my background on the screen, and talking about those different things together. And when I find we do that, amazing things can happen with groups where they co-create their future. For example, some of the conversation that about West Virginia and what they're doing. I worked there for 8 years. Most of us look at West Virginia as if it's sort of backwards. West Virginia has been abused terribly by the coal industry, and so they're very distrustful. They're very scattered and rural, so a lot of people are not well educated, but they're not stupid. And when we came together, and I shared this story with Lowell and Stuart, I was a plant manager in a big chemical plant. There were 13 chemical plants in the Kanawha Valley, 8 different companies. We handled highly hazardous materials, so I had a 20,000 ton anhydrous ammonia storage tank that people were worried about. Rome Pellenc handled methyl isocyanate, which was the bad chemical that hurt the people in Bhopal. The people lived right on the other side of the fence line. And so the community asked all the chemical companies to share their worst case scenarios, which is this: if you lose the largest quantity of your most toxic materials, what happens to us in the community? And the plume examples that we developed for my ammonia tank would, an hour exposure could kill people 30 miles away. So, you know, these things had some pretty big repercussions if they got away from us. So I helped lead the community using this process Enneagram model that is shown up there, but I didn't do it explicitly. As I was helping to lead this, I was operating out of this. And after a 2-year effort, we shared 29 different ways in which the chemical companies could kill the people in the community, and trust went up. And the community came together. It was using processes of dialogue, talking about what is it we're really trying to do? How can we do it? How can we do it better? How can we include diverse groups of people? So we had the hospitals and the first responders and the environmentalists and the companies and community people in dialogue for 2 years about how to do this. And so there are tools that are available to do a lot of the things that I hear being discussed down at the practical level, down with communities. And I've done workshops using this model hundreds of times around the world. And I've come to realize it has 2 basic fundamental processes. One is around self-organization, and one is around how work actually gets done. How do we actually do things? When those 2 come into harmony, astonishing things happen. So we need to pay attention to these deeper processes that are there. And what I've found is that I've never had people reject this work as I've worked with them, because I think what all I'm doing is helping them to discover what they already know in their subconscious. And it surfaces and they begin to operate in ways that they deeply know. Now it takes, for me, a wake up for that was a fire that we had at our plant, which stripped off a lot of the superficial command and control crap and all these other things. When your place is on fire, you got to get the darn thing out. And you got to get back into operations and be sure no one's hurt. So these invisible processes became visible. Most of the time, they're invisible to most people until we pay attention. So these are the kind of things that, you know, as I'm listening to you, there are ways for us to come together. So I guess that's about what I wanted to say. It's a powerful way in which to engage a diverse group of people. It always works to solve problems, providing they are willing to talk and listen, which is a big proviso right now. Thank you.
Well, I have lots of things to say, but I just want to start with Lutz. He was pointing out correctly that the society is made of many, many different views. And I think also in the sciences, you describe actually what I often call different discourses. That language is not just language. English language is one English language. You can see in the dictionary, but there are different discourses, different vocabularies. And cybernetics, at least the original cybernetics, has a particular type of terminology that is, if applied, produces all kinds of things. And I think what I said last time is that there are always unanticipated consequences or externalities, things that are not governed by that particular type of view. And I don't want to reproduce. Maybe I should up this slide that I put up last time. You know, for cybernetics, there are individual participation issues, but there are always unintended consequences, and they are huge. And so I think what George initially said, you know, that we are in a process of getting into the disaster, that is a result of actually externalities of our conceptions taking over. And I think this is what we have to realize. And if we look at the consequences of that, is that we increasingly lose control over those. So I think this is I think a big problem for me. That what I'm saying, that the agency, the ability to do things, is systematically reduced by the unchecked growth of externalities. And that whether it's biological or not, in this case it is not biological, but this is to me the critical point. And then I'm saying there are actually two feedback loops, if you want. The one is the deviation amplifying, and that is what the externalities which we don't address within the concept of our conceptions. And the other one is what we use, and when we use mathematical models, etc., we minimize agency. You make us increasingly disabled to handle them. So that is the reason why I think it is important to have interdisciplinary conversations. And that is what I think cybernetics, the origin of cybernetics is from, maybe the Macy Foundations. And that's what we are doing in some sense, even though we don't deal with a very particular type of problem. But I think putting many disciplines together and solving some of the externalities that are otherwise unchecked. And to me, that is part of critical cybernetics, is to do this not only in collaboration with others, but also in such a way that it can be re-entered in the system of which it is taken.
So I would like to address that though. When you look at the Earth, the whole Earth as a system, there are no externalities. Everything's going on within the system.
Your look has externalities. You can't see everything. You see only what you see. What is outside are the externalities.
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm saying if you step back and look at the Earth as a whole,
you can't see the whole. Never. You can't step back and see the whole. And the way humans deal with that is constructing beliefs, which are unfounded concepts. And if you look at what Klaus was saying, I would put the opposite point in that societies made up a lot of diverse opinions, yes, but often societies are made up by some common beliefs. And if you want to look at the COVID crisis, two countries did particularly badly, the USA and the UK, with some of the highest rates. Both those countries have very high beliefs of personal freedom. So that there's a feedback loop between all of this that's going on that you can't ignore. It's not top down or bottom up, it's both at the same time, and you're inside that loop trying to understand it. But my feeling is that I go back to say that you are trying to construct a model from inside the model, and it gets incredibly hard.
I didn't say it was easy. But if you look at the whole of system science instead of just one aspect, you'll find that it is possible to build such models.
And I would suggest that cybernetics, one of the first issues you need to address if you're going to address this from cybernetics perspective, but bearing in mind that systems thinking originally was the science of sciences. It tried to bring everything together.
Yes,
The criticism that's been leveled at cybernetics is it doesn't involve human emotions, which are fundamental to human decision making. And until we build that model into the fact that humans use emotions considerably and beliefs to make their decisions, cybernetics doesn't provide all the answers.
Klaus,
no discipline provide all the answers. And that is the whole reason why we should work together across disciplines.
Klaus, could you share your PPT today, the slides that you can send?
I had them up. I don't know what.
You can email to me and I will email to this group.
I can do that, yes.
And also for those of you who are not sure if I have your correct email address, please let me know. Otherwise, I will send it to 19 people today for this. Well, as Jamie said, when I click that end button and you guys are released back to your reality. But here I want to say our 2-hour movie is also a reality that we are making together from our world 2 into world 3 in Popper's term. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.